Today, I'm joined by Rory Sutherland, of course, the leader of the MadMasters course, and Tom Ridges, the CEO and founder of Herdify. The topic of today's session is essentially talking about challenger brands and what you can do when essentially you can't outspend your competition. Can you try and outsmart them, and really what's happening in the world right now?
Well, assuming you have limited resources, there's one approach, which is to concentrate on a sweet spot. But I'm a big devotee of the Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger axiom, which is always invert, which is don't just ask the question, who are we trying to reach? You can actually get a whole new creative insight by asking the opposite question, which is who should we not bother with for now? And I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned Zuckerberg. In the field of classical direct marketing, there was both a media approach and a creative approach, which really I always described as one sentence that was worth $1 billion, which was the American Express card invitation to apply letter, which started with the sentence, quite frankly, comma, the American Express card is not for everyone. And, you know, if they had, why that was so critical is, in a sense, they knew they were going to use direct mail as the only effective means of acquisition. Yeah. Direct mail has lots of disadvantages in terms of cost of reach, but it has one big advantage, which is you can make the person who receives it feel special. And similarly, I mean, I think, you know, a large part of this, by the way, the other phrase I use, which I think is useful for Herdify, is real life is a medium too. Mm-hmm. Okay, which is we don't just sort of walk around in a daze and then occasionally we get exposed to a bit of bought media communication, and we use that bit of bought media communication to kind of recalibrate our perception of the brand, and then we move on. Okay, we're influenced by everything, the people around us, what's on the shelves, what the supermarkets seem to be stocking a lot of, what your friends consume, the car your friends drive, whether your neighbors have a solar panel, and so forth. And we're a herd species. I mean, there are two fundamental default modes. If you look at your digital camera, it has a kind of, well, not you have a digital camera anymore because you use your phones, but every digital camera has a kind of default setting, which is what it does in the absence of other overriding information. And two huge default modes in the human brain are do what I've done before, which is habit, and do what everybody else does, which is herdification or social copying.
Do you know, sorry, you were going to
go? They're perfectly rational, by the way, because if you don't have enough information to make a decision, okay, maybe other people do. And copying them, therefore, is socially rational when you have limited search costs, search resources. Okay, if you find yourself in a new tribe of people and everybody's eating the purple berries and no one eats the yellow berries, best default mode is, unless you run out of purple berries, don't try the yellow ones. Yeah. And there's a perfectly good evolutionary reason for it, which is all these people seem to be doing this thing and they're still alive. Therefore, it's much more sensible to copy people who are alive than to experiment and end up copying people who ended up dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking about this the other day. I've ended up in a bit of a YouTube rabbit warren of Jimmy Carr. Big fan of his. I know you're talking to him at MadFest. He's local to us. And what I always love about his content is Jimmy Carr, I'm sure most people have seen and come across his content, but he's a stand-up comedian here in the UK. But he deliberately has content that's on the edge of what's acceptable. He's a very well-dressed, middle-class chap who just says some frankly disgusting stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I love is in the room, everyone in that room has gone there, knows who he is, knows that he's on the edge there. And when he says his sort of extreme stuff, everyone's outsourcing their opinion of whether they should laugh or not to the rest of the room. You can hear the kind of the silence, the deep breaths, and the should I laugh, should I not? And then inevitably someone laughs and the ripples break out. And I just, love that everyone would react very differently if they're watching that on YouTube or at home on their sofa. But what's acceptable, even what we find funny, is driven by that room of strangers.
Do you know what I learned on YouTube last night? Because one of the great joys of having YouTube Premium is in any hotel in the world now, you can basically watch YouTube Premium. Oh. And I was watching this documentary about Frank Sinatra. His manager actually staged auditions for girls who could scream really loudly. and basically seeded all Frank's concerts with girls who had really loud screams.
There we go.
So, yeah, there you go. And actually, they knew this. I mean, there's a famous thing, which is that if the people in the front stand up to give you a standing ovation, everybody else does. Your influence over a standing ovation depends on what the front row does, very largely, because they're visible, whereas the people behind you aren't.
Yeah,
you know, the people behind you can be stripped naked for all you know, and throwing that, you know. So that's the kind of thing which, that's the kind of thing which is really, really interesting.
There's actually, I know of one, there may be many, there's a paper written on the optimum way to manipulate a standing ovation in terms of maximizing visibility. So front row, and then where do you seed everyone else to get the max visibility with the fewest number of people? How do you trigger the biggest cascade with the fewest inputs, which is brilliant because it just comes down to a lot of this that, you know, repeatable once you understand it's about visibility. So it's good to know that Sinatra did it as well.
And actually, hyper concentration in a place. I mean, you mentioned by the way, you mentioned a lovely thing, didn't you? I think when you looked at data on Ford sales,
mm-hmm.
and there's a particular cluster of really loyal Ford buyers, now which persists years after the dealership closed. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, one of our clients, they're a Ford dealership, and they were in the West Country, and they closed. And then when we were doing some analysis, we said, well, look, we can detect that people are really passionate and talking about and influencing each other about the brand, and they've got to drive past 2 or 3 other Ford garages to get to the other one, and they're willing to make that extra journey because fundamentally, you kind of talked about the evolutionary side there. If everyone else is still buying from that one that's 2 hours away, the short piece in your head the shortcut in your head says, well, there's probably other things wrong with the local ones, or there's got to be a good reason they're all driving 2 hours. No one stopped to ask the question to each other and go, quickly, there's 1 hour away. Is there a reason that you're still driving 3 hours away? We just take the fact they're doing it as, well, they've obviously thought about it, so I'll copy them, and that reinforcement never ends, and therefore the memory is persistent, which is beautiful in terms of just how it appears on a map.
It has real importance, by the way, normalization. If you're interested, any of you interested in sort of environmental questions, there's just as if you have, in some countries they pay people to visibly drink Guinness in a pub early on, because if there's someone drinking Guinness in the pub, Guinness has a great advantage as a beer, as being basically visibly distinguishable from all other beers. Cider has a disadvantage until you put ice in it, which is no one can tell you're drinking cider, not lager.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they actually exploit that by, it's not a bad job, I guess, turn up at the pub really early at opening time. You're not allowed to drink that much, but you have to stand around visibly consuming Guinness. In the same way, solar panels, there's this massive cluster effect where if 2 people on the street get them, it's then every subsequent sale becomes easier and easier.
Yeah. Two points there. The Guinness one I find fascinating because you've all seen the rise of Guinness Zero. Okay, now I'm not a Guinness drinker. I've probably had 1 pint of Guinness in the last 10 years, but I think I've probably had 10 pints of Guinness Zero in the last 6 weeks. Right? And that's not because I've gone on a taste test and think what's the best zero beers or what I want to spend my time is. I play paddle with a bunch of guys. At the end of the event, they all have a Guinness Zero, and it's just easier for me to fit in. Even knowing what I know about our business, I still conform, and I just started drinking it more, not because I think Guinness is a better drink. It's just what my mates are drinking when we're drinking zeros, and I think they've played a great move. And I guess it's fueled by what you're saying. It's also distinctly obvious, when people say, "Are you drinking Guinness?" Because it's, and you can say, "Oh, no."
And by the way, like vaping, zero alcohol beer is a really, really interesting phenomenon because it represents a behavior which was probably a fantasy of both Public Health England when it existed and the Department for Transport.
Yeah.
Which is, wouldn't it be great if we could get people to go to the pub, and at least one of them, in the case of the Department for Transport, or a lot of them, in the case of Public Health England, just started having, because one problem with Britain was actually another social effect, which was the round system, which is you were forced to drink at the speed of the heaviest drinker in the group, basically. Okay. And so having the option to do zebra drinking, which is where you alternate zero alcohol and alcoholic, or the driver doesn't drink at all, or people who just don't want to drink that much can actually continue to participate in the social, the social compulsion, which is the round system, without either feeling left out or getting pissed.
Yeah.
Now, what's so fascinating about that is it's a total marketing fantasy for, as I said, the Department for Transport and Public Health England, but it happened bottom up.
Yeah.
You know, it's undoubtedly a thing that was just a phenomenon that started. There is an interesting question psychologically, which is no one anticipates that zero alcohol wine is going anywhere. And why is that? Which is just an interesting question. But it's a really interesting phenomenon. And as also, you know, I mean, it's an extraordinarily potent thing. There's famously, you know, a colleague of mine doing research said, you know, that effectively social cues are an enormous determinant of behavior. They're often quite inexpensive to actually engineer, particularly if you can localize them. And yet they get ridiculously little attention.
Yeah. Well, interesting when you said the bottom up side, there's also that from an age group point of view. I was reading something, I think it was in the FT, which shows the context of the article being there, to be honest with you. But they were talking about, you know, the certain generation of leaders that read the FT, you would probably not tar with the brush that says they are your typical alcohol-free drinker. Okay. But actually what they're saying is because a lot of the younger people and that movement's spreading, actually at that middle management level, there's a bunch of people who are now turning up on a Monday morning who are clear-headed. And there's that herd mentality is forming in terms of, well, you actually feel left out if you're the one that's not clear-headed. So it's starting to propagate into, it's the beauty of how this spreading works. It's now spreading even further into the kind of dark reaches who you would never say would enter that world, but no. They don't want to be this new herd that's forming, this, you know, this herd that can perform on a Monday morning, clarity of thought, and they don't want to be outside that. So it's causing that, you know, that inclusion higher up as well, which I thought was fascinating.
I think it's a very interesting question with vaping, by the way, which I think is quite concerning. I was on a podcast about this a few days ago, which is generally middle-class people who are in the decision-making world don't know that many people who smoke. So they see vaping as unnecessary. If you go to a working class place, you go outside a vape shop or you go outside actually the corner shop, there were sort of 600 of those Lost Mary stickers stuck on the bin where people had come out of the shop, peeled the thing off the bottom, stuck it on the thing. And I suddenly said, what you've got to realize is every one of those stickers, you know, I'm not encouraging littering, but every one of those stickers is a packet of cigarettes that someone didn't smoke.
Yeah.
Okay, that's, you know, and so one of the problems you get in marketing is that marketing people often exist in a milieu which is completely atypical of the milieu in which their customers find themselves.
Mm-hmm. Those stickers also act as social reinforcement. It reminds me of the Red Bull example that you'll both be familiar with, and maybe we've talked about before, but in the early days, they stuffed the bins outside nightclubs with empty cans of Red Bull. So people thought, oh, I didn't drink that tonight, but everyone else did and had a good night. Maybe I'm missing out. And I imagine
maybe I'm missing out.
Stickers are having the same effect. And maybe in a positive way, that maybe that's the tipping point for someone who's going in to buy a pack of cigarettes and they see 50 stickers and they're like, well, do you know what? Maybe I should try it. It'll be interesting to see if there's any data around that, to see that repeated exposure to that sticker reinforces that people like me are making the switch from cigarettes to vaping, which, as you say, from a public health point of view, is a no-brainer.
I mean, the non-alcohol, we should, with no alcohol beer, we shouldn't discount the fact that obviously it got a lot better. Okay, it's not only about a herd effect. There's another marketing effect, which is always claimed probably by Lucky Saint, which is that everybody else launched their low alcohol beer by saying it's a low alcohol beer, which was basically saying it's not that shit honest.
Yeah.
And Lucky Saint went out and launched with it's a great beer, and by the way, it's really low in alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so, you know, there are other factors, but what's undoubtedly true is that somehow there's a social norm which probably starts locally. It then reaches a tipping point, and then once you reach the tipping point, I think there's a kind of escape velocity. Okay, I talked about habit and social copying. There's this kind of escape velocity where something goes from seeming weird and is anxious making because it's an unfamiliar behavior. And that's why, by the way, those of you who know about the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, many of you know what the Ehrenberg is about. It's Andrew Ehrenberg and his fantastic work on the statistics of, the dominance in brand leadership and double jeopardy and all that stuff. Bass is the Bass diffusion curve, which is a sigmoid curve, which shows how new behaviors, new products, new technologies effectively how they disperse through the population. And it's basically slow, then faster and faster and faster. And then as you exhaust the possible market space, which, by the way, in the case of mobile phones is probably 100%, but in the case of air fryers is probably 50%, and in the case of Japanese toilets is probably 10%, okay? You'll see exactly that same pattern. And why that's really, really important to know is a lot of people give up on ideas too soon because they go, this isn't really taking off. And the reason it's not taking off isn't because of the product or the customer, it's because of other people.
Well, sorry to interrupt you there. If you want to watch the rest of this live stream, you're going to have to join the full edition of the MadMasters course. Now, what is MadMasters, you might ask? It's a course that blends behavioural science, creativity, and data, and it's all delivered to you by the one and only Rory Sutherland. Through monthly live sessions, on-demand Netflix-style modules, load of bonus sessions, and even an in-person meetup at the biggest marketing event in London, there's 30 plus hours of content delivered to you exclusively by Rory. So what are you waiting for? Pull the trigger and register now.